Hello, this is Rick Kyte with Ethics Today, and we're going to be talking with Pete Gathje, who is Vice President of Academic Affairs at Memphis Theological Seminary and Profession of Christian Ethics, and also a founder of a Catholic worker house in Memphis, Tennessee called Manna House, which he helped to found 15 years ago, and that deals with many of the social issues that are going on in Memphis, but especially it's a house of hospitality for anybody who wants to come and be welcomed as a guest. And what we're seeing during this time of pandemic is really increased need among our most vulnerable populations. And so, Pete, I just wanted to talk to you about what you're seeing, and also kind of what you think we should be better as we address everybody in our society. So first of all, thank you, Pete, for joining me today.
It's good to be here, Rick. It's good to see you, even at a distance.
Yeah.
So, well, what's going on in Memphis is not unlike what's going on really in every major city in the United States with regard to homelessness. Numbers are starting to go up. It's probably going to go up significantly later through the summer and into the fall with more and more evictions that will be taking place.
Has there been a moratorium on evictions in Tennessee?
There has. It's supposed to end May 31st, so next week. And I haven't been able to find out if it's going to be extended, but probably not. It's pretty typical of other states as well that had these moratoriums. They're all ending either at the end of this month or sometime in June. And that means, no one's going to get evicted right away because the eviction process takes a little while. But certainly by August or September, and definitely by October, November, there'll be a larger number of people without housing. And that's at the root of homelessness, is people are homeless because they don't have homes. Housing is not affordable.
Right.
And so, in people who were in jobs in which they were barely able to make rent have lost those jobs, and so they're not going to be paying rent, and they're going to get evicted.
Well, so many people with what we might call marginal incomes are working in service area jobs, and those are the ones that are most hardest hit, right, during this pandemic, in restaurants and hotels and things like that.
Yeah, and it's in Memphis, the service economy was a fairly significant part of the economy, and also warehouses and transportation. Now, those are doing okay because increased online shopping. But definitely the restaurants are being shuttered around here already. Places that have been in business, 3, 4, 5 years or a little bit longer are going out of business, and that trend is just going to continue.
So are you seeing more people coming to Manna House on a daily basis? And has that been increasing over the past couple of months, or so far has it been staying pretty steady?
It's been staying pretty steady. I mean, in some respects, we've seen fewer people because we've cut back some of our services due to safety regulations that we're trying to operate under. But the demand for those services is still high. So what I've been doing is I talk with our guests when they come, and they're letting me know that it's pretty desperate out on the streets. Shelters have either stopped operation or they've cut the numbers that they allow in. But the same number or slightly increasing numbers of people are on the streets. And then some of the standard places where people could go that are not places of direct hospitality, like fast food restaurants or the public library, those have all been closed too. So there's been no access for bathrooms or just to get a drink of water to wash up. So it's pretty bleak for people on the streets.
But tell me a little more about Manna House. I know it's a Catholic worker house. You describe it as a house of hospitality. What services do you provide, and how does it differ from, say, a soup kitchen or something like the Salvation Army that provides overnight shelter and that sort of thing?
So if we were a social service agency, they would classify us as a day shelter.
Mhm.
What that means is people come to us 3 mornings a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, for showers, change of clothes, and really just a place to be welcomed and to be safe, to not be harassed or hassled by the police. So we welcome anywhere from 100 to 120 people each morning that we're open. And we also do serve a meal on Monday evenings. That's usually 80 to 100 people. We have sort of our regulars, people that we've seen for a number of years. That's probably about a third of the people who come. And the other 2/3 are more transient, who we may see for a month or two, and then we don't see anymore.
Are they traveling through Memphis, or are they just kind of temporarily homeless or in need, so they come to you for showers and so forth for a short period of time, but then they get more stability in their lives and they find housing? Is that what's going on?
It's both of those things. So some people are kind of passing through, and then there are people who are sort of off and on homeless. So they're probably like couch surfing or staying with a friend or a relative. And then for whatever reason that comes to an end, then they're back out on the streets for a while. Then they find another place where they can kind of crash for a month or two. Then they're back out on the streets. One of the things Memphis, like other cities, has been taking a housing first approach to try to address homelessness.
Mhm.
And that does get people housed, but often that's short term for 6 months or so. And if they're not able to find work to start to pay rent, then they end up back out on the streets. And one of the problems in Memphis for people to keep a job is that our public transportation system is horrendously bad. So, and a lot of the jobs are out of the inner city. So if you're say staying in a shelter, or you're able to get low income housing somewhere inside the city, most of the jobs that people would get, like warehouse jobs, are on the periphery of the city, like out near the airport.
Right, right. Now, you don't describe yourself just as providing social services, though, right?
That's right. So as a house of hospitality, what we're really focused on is building relationship with people, and welcoming people, as it says in Matthew 25:31-46. Whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. Jesus is speaking. So we welcome each other as they are the very presence of Christ. I sometimes talk about this with other volunteers or visitors, that hospitality is like the 8th sacrament,
Mm.
that the presence of Christ is in the people who come to us, the guests. And it was instituted by Christ in Matthew 25:31-46. So it kind of fits the standard definition of a sacrament, instituted by Christ as a means of grace. And so for hospitality, we see that practice as different from charity, which is often dispensed from above, from a position of superiority. And we try to come alongside our guests, and we recognize that our guests are really evangelizing us. They're the ones who are bringing Christ to us. We're not bringing Christ to them. So, yeah, we're different from a Salvation Army or a Union Mission kind of place that sees itself as sort of offering services in order to win souls. If anybody's souls are being won in the services we're offering, it's our own souls. Our guests are already saved. They're already close to God. In fact, they teach me all the time, as a professor of Christian ethics, professor of theology, I learn a tremendous amount of theology from the people who come to Manna House on a regular basis.
Well, there is this tradition in, I guess, in the teaching about hospitality in the Christian tradition historically, that there's something that takes place, the host-guest reversal, in which,
yes,
right, you set up, it's your house, right, and you invite the guest in, but then they end up conferring some kind of blessing on you, and so that in a way they become the host within your own home.
That's exactly right. I can give you a story that illustrates that. This is from a few years back when my dad died. I went up to Minnesota for the funeral, came back, and I'm serving at Manna House. And one of the guests comes up to me and he's in tears. And I said, Stephen, what's wrong? And he said, I'm just filled with sorrow over the death of your dad. And he said, I know what loss is, and I'm with you in this loss. And I thought, that's the best pastoral statement I've heard since my dad died. And that's, that, right, when Kathleen had, who's my partner at Manna House, my wife, when she had breast cancer, the guests gathered around her, laid their hands on her, and prayed for her as she was going into radiation treatment. I mean, it's powerful. Our guests are powerful people of prayer, and they share that with us. They share their lives with us, and all we're doing is offering some fairly paltry stuff like a shower and a change of clothes. I mean, it's important, but they're giving their very lives to us.
That's an incredible story, and it goes right to the heart of something that's happened in our Western societies, is the kind of distance that is created in our social services kind of industry. We've created this framework where we become really pretty efficient at providing for lots of needs. So we don't have a lot of people starving anymore, because we're pretty good at distributing food. Maybe not always healthy food, but right, distributing food, finding ways of sheltering people, taking care of healthcare. And there's, we're always debating proposals to make this better, but Western societies generally do a pretty good job of taking care of needs. But the only way to do this really efficiently is to make it depersonalized. And so that many of those who are, what we do, actually, we hire people to interact with the people who need the services. So as a taxpayer, I'm paying money that goes into, Medicaid and the, food programs and everything else, right? But I'm not directly interacting with the people in need unless I volunteer in one of these organizations.
Right.
Hospitality, what you're doing is you're getting directly involved in the personal relationships.
That's right. And those social services are important. And that bureaucracy is important as a kind of safety net for basic physical needs. And of course, it's not as good of a net as it ought to be by far. And so we're addressing some of the gaps sometimes in that safety net even, but what we're really doing is trying to offer people a place where they're treated like people. That they're a name, not a number for us. We're not set up to be efficient. In fact, one of our slogans around Manna House is that efficiency is the work of the devil. And sort of said that tongue in cheek, but it's true. We're not set up to try to address every need, and we're not set up to just run people through a system. We're really there for people to come and be treated, as I said, as human beings, as people made in the image of God, who deserve respect, who deserve that their dignity be recognized and affirmed. And that, we're not asking them to prove that they're homeless. We're not asking for identification. We don't do intake analysis or anything like that. People just show up. So in fact, a number of our guests, probably about a third of our guests, are not homeless. They're people from the neighborhood, our low income folks who simply need a place, like people who go to Starbucks want a place to just hang out for a while. Instead of Starbucks, people who are low income can come and hang out with us for a while.
Well, I'm involved with some organizations that provide funding for some of these services, and what we're always asking for is a demonstration of how you're using the funds. And so, right. And you're not doing an analysis, right?
We aren't. And
how do you get your funding? I mean, do you get grants, or this is just donations that's coming from individuals?
Yeah, it's donations from individuals and some churches, synagogues, mosques. even the local Hindu temple has given us sizable donation. So yeah, we're completely supported by donations. Of course, none of us are paid. We're an all volunteer staff. So that keeps the cost down pretty significantly. Our yearly budget's about $35,000. And with that, like I said, we serve about 80 to 120 or so people 3 mornings a week that we're open, plus the meal on Mondays. Yeah. So, but we're not, we have like individual success stories that we could share with people who want to hear those things, but that's not our focus. Our focus is really solidarity and accompaniment, that we, like I said, we come alongside our guests and welcome them as fellow human beings. And then it's really those relationships ultimately that if people are looking for success stories, those are the things that are transformative both for ourselves and for our guests. So, I mean, we've had guests who have come back to us and said, you know, when I first came here, I was on the streets. I thought I was a worthless human being. I was completely depressed and down on myself. And you guys just treated me like anybody else, you know, it treated me like somebody who's a friend of yours. Mm-hmm. And that gave me a sense of my own dignity and gave me a sense of hope again. And so I started trying to get connected to some of the social services, even because he'd given up on that. Because, you know, the reality is, like, you go to Social Security office to try to get Social Security benefits, good luck. If you don't have a lawyer, you're going to get put through the ringer. You're trying to get disability, guaranteed you'll get turned down at least the first 2 times that you apply, and you'll probably just get turned down permanently if you don't have a lawyer advocating for you. So the system is set up to grind people down, to really turn them away. And we're set up to welcome people and to say, we're here with you. And in fact, sometimes we accompany people to those places.
So I was going to ask you that. So, and if people need legal advice for something that they're dealing with, trying to get access to like services that they qualify or, you know, benefits, do you help them with legal services and things like that as well?
Well, we don't do legal because we're, you know, none of us are lawyers, but it's really accompaniment. So like this one guy was having problems at one of the local hospitals just getting his prescription filled. So I just went with him and stood there as he talked with the person who was trying to turn him down again. And I said, aren't you all here really to fill these prescriptions? The person looked at me and said, oh, yeah. So they filled the prescription. I mean, but they were, you know, they presume, and it works, you know, if they just keep saying no, someone will go away. But if somebody else is standing there, and of course this was African-American man, elderly African-American man, and then I'm standing there as a, you know, white, sort of middle-aged, or getting a little older now, but, and saying, look, help this guy, or I'm going to call the local newspaper. So I have some access that maybe this guy doesn't, and that can turn the situation around.
So how much of that, like your effectiveness at getting results in a situation like that, is due to you being white? How much is it due to you being, like, your personality, I can tell, is being pretty persistent. You're not going to take no for an answer. And how much is it that you're just articulate and you're fairly educated about these things, and so you know what is going on and how to talk about it? Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's being white middle-class males. I know how to navigate systems, because that's what I've done through my life, and the systems have typically worked for me. So that's not the case for an older African-American man who has been turned away and told no repeatedly, and may have more of a tendency to give up at that point because he just, you know, the system's set up against him. So yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I'm a white male who comes in and says, I can call the newspaper. Here, it's on my phone. There's a woman here with a local newspaper, Wendy Thomas, and I just say her name, and they're like, oh no, don't call Wendy Thomas. So
average person on the streets, a homeless person, doesn't have that kind of access. And yeah, it has a lot to do with race. It has a lot to do with class. And of course, all of both of those play into being, educated and all of those sorts of things as well.
I'm sure one of the questions you get from people who just find out about this work that you're doing, you're in the inner city of Memphis. Memphis, by all the statistics, it's a pretty dangerous city. It's in the top 10 category in the nation for violent crimes, and it is year after year. And you're working in an area in which a lot of crime takes place. Is it dangerous? And like, what is your experience working in that place, and how do you address the fears that some people have about joining you in that kind of effort?
I would say this, that, we've been open 15 years. We've never had bloodshed on the property. Our guests from the streets, from the neighborhood, they love Manor House. It's their place and they protect it. So we've certainly had conflicts. We've had an occasional fight, that sort of thing, but we've never called the police. We simply say to the guests who are involved, leave now, or we shut the place down. And nobody wants to be responsible for Manor House being shut down, because the other guests are not going to be very happy about that. So it's really, the guests treat Manor House as their place, and they respect the place. They respect the people who are there, which is each other and us. And we just haven't had violence. The most threatening situations that we've ever had has really been because of the police, who have showed up and presumed that they could just walk onto the property and yank people off the property. And we don't allow the police on the property because they have weapons.
You don't allow anybody with weapons?
No, we don't. So even somebody's like walking up carrying a stick, we say, you got to leave the stick on the sidewalk. You can't bring that in here. Now, does that mean people don't have weapons? No. I mean, we don't have a metal detector or anything like that. In fact, one morning, it was around Christmas time, we were having sort of a party, and there was some music, and this woman was dancing. And as she was dancing, a knife fell out of her brassiere and clattered onto the floor. She just sort of swept down in her dance move and picked it up and put it back in and continued on. Then we asked her to leave. So, but it's people, the people who come to Manor House are people who are more often the victims of violence themselves than the perpetrators of violence. They get beat up, they get robbed, they get harassed. They don't like violence. I mean, they're trying to avoid violence.
Yeah, yeah. I also want to ask you about race, because Memphis is a city that's had a lot of racial tensions over the years. I would imagine that you're in the minority as a white male in that part of Memphis.
Right.
How do you negotiate? I mean, is race a problem for you in doing that kind of work in the inner city of Memphis, and how do you deal with it?
Race is a problem everywhere because white people have created this system of race that systemically discriminates and oppresses people of color. So Memphis is about 60% or so African American, but the economic and political power here is firmly in the hands of white people. So, I mean, we have a white mayor. And, we've had African American mayors in the past, but we currently have a white mayor in a city that's 60% African American.
Yeah.
The business class here, the majority of the people who are wealthy business people in this city are white. Memphis has been described as a plantation town. And in some ways it really is. So, one of the largest employers here is FedEx. owned by, a white family, and it survives, or it thrives in terms of the distribution center here. The people who are doing all of the sorting are part-time not unionized folks who are being paid, it's not a living wage. And that's what really makes FedEx possible. And the warehouse distribution stuff that's here, almost all minimum wage or slightly above minimum wage jobs, keep people in poverty, keep them dependent upon these bad jobs to survive at all. It's really a plantation. So that's, race here is always in the air. As a city in the South, it's going to be for sure. There's a long history of racism in the city. It continues to this very day in the way in which economic and political power are set up. So at Manor House, certainly our guests who are African American, which is the majority of our guests are African American, and the volunteers, most of whom are white, we're very aware of those power dynamics and the inequalities and the history that goes way back that keep those dynamics going today. So the thing that I found is that honest, open confession and discussion is the best way to address those issues as they may come up at Manor House. So, for example, if a guest says to me, you're being racist, I say, I probably am. Tell me more. Tell me what's going on, the way you're seeing this situation, so that maybe we can change something together. And the other thing is the guests see that we have their backs in terms of like not allowing the police onto the property. That's a huge thing. They know that we've gone to jail occasionally in acts of civil disobedience related to homelessness and poverty and violence. And so they know where our commitments are, and that makes a big difference. But sometimes the racism comes to like an African-American man who approached me and say something like, hey boss, what do I need to do to get something around here? And I have to say, first of all, I'm not your boss. Second of all, let me tell you about how the place works. And then let's have a conversation about why you called me boss in the first place, if you want to. But so those things can come up from time to time. Really, I think it happened a lot more when we first opened. It doesn't happen quite as much anymore because we have sort of street credibility at this point.
Well, and you've developed relationships and nurtured them over a period of years, right. So you built trust.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. I'll give you one example of that building trust. We had a guest came to us pretty much when we first opened, and we asked him what his name was to write it down. We just take first names to write down, like for the shower list. And he said, call me James. So for about 5 years, we were calling him James. And then one day he came and said, my name's not really James. My name's John. And I said, well, why did you tell us that your name was James? He said, I had to wait until I could trust you. It's 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. To give you his real name, which gives you a kind of power, right, in the relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, we're talking today just a few days after the murder in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Well, I'm saying murder, killing of a black man by a police officer, Minneapolis police officer. And the riots have been taking place the last 2 days. And I know you had a lot of protests there in Memphis over this.
Yes, we have.
What I'm hearing over and over again is this demand for systems change. And yet it seems to me that what we don't talk enough about is that culture change and relationship building, the development of trust, which takes a long time to do, right? You don't get trust through making a quick change to something in our system.
Right. So, they're linked. I think systemic change and cultural change go hand in hand. Give an example of this related to the murder of Mr. Floyd. So the police are part of the criminal justice system. And the criminal justice system is, in our society, because of our culture, is set up as a retributive, a punishing system. The police are kind of the spear point or gun point of that system. They're set up to presume punishment, retribution. And so it's not surprising that we would have repeatedly over time in cities across the United States, the police acting as people of punishment, of retribution, rather than people of building community or restoration, or to use a Christian term, redemption. That's the way the system's set up. And there's of course, a whole theology behind that system, of a view of God, even that God is retributive, that God is a punisher. And so how do we change that system? Well, it requires a cultural change of moving from a retributive form of justice to a restorative form of justice, and then having policing reflect restorative justice rather than retributive justice. That's a big challenge, and it's complicated by race.
And it's not a change that you can bring about, say, by getting rid of a few bad actors. If you've got something that's set up based on this idea of retribution, you're always in a way developing more bad actors.
That's right.
And I don't know how you would. Any culture kind of establishes a certain set of social norms, right? And I've talked to a number of police chiefs around the country, and mostly in smaller towns and places that work really hard to develop a cultural change, getting to know the people in the neighborhoods, in the communities in which the officers are serving, and so forth. And this can be pretty successful over a period of time, but I guess it's especially hard in these big cities.
Yeah, I would think so. It's definitely harder because you have a whole culture within the police department itself. And part of it is that, policing is hard work. You're going up in and day out, you're being called to crisis situations where people are acting badly. Right? And so you get calloused. And that's very hard to resist that callousness, especially when it's also backed up by a whole system that is encouraging retribution. Yeah. So, yeah, and smaller towns, it helps because you may know the people that you're being called to address in that moment of crisis. And you know their history. You've had a relationship with them. You're not just going by in a police cruiser occasionally. So it's a very different setting. I have a brother-in-law who was the sheriff of Olmsted County in southern Minnesota for a number of years. And that was one of his main things was trying to build those kinds of relationships through his officers in the sheriff's department. One of the reasons it's connected with homelessness, actually, he was an advocate for housing first for people who were on the streets, because he saw that, just arresting people and putting them in jail, that's not addressing any underlying issues. It's not addressing their lack of housing. So get people into housing first, and then you can start to address maybe if somebody has an addiction issue or mental illness or both, or needs job training or just needs a stable place to live. It's a challenge to make that kind of big cultural change, but I think that's where the church needs to come in. It's where nonprofits need to enter in and say, look, there are other ways that we could be doing this. Let's at least start with some pilot programs, get those launched, and you'll start to see they actually work better. Community policing, where you have the police officers living in the community in which they police, makes a difference. If you have people like Minneapolis, a lot of their officers don't live in Minneapolis. So they're not tied into the city. They're tied into a different mentality. And for them, it's just a job. And they know that they'll survive in their job if they're hard asses, right? Because the least little bit of humanity that you might show might be exploited in a crisis situation.
Well, I was looking last year at some statistics on police suicide. That's been going up really considerably over the last 10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it correlates pretty strongly with the number of kind of serious incidents that they respond to. So the number of calls they take per day. And that has risen dramatically. And so you think you're encountering more and more stressful situations. And this is going back to efficiency, right? We're making all our organizations more efficient. And there's a human price to pay when you ask people to do more and more, especially of these really stressful things. You know, how often can you put yourself in a position of danger
Mm-hmm.
without it having effect on how you view every encounter, right?
Right. That's right. And imagine now too, we're living in a society where the social safety net is just being destroyed. And part of that's related to the pandemic, but the trajectory was there beforehand on political leadership cutting programs that were specifically in place to help people who are struggling. So you start to take out that safety net, plus you increase the amount of social suffering because of the pandemic, and we're living in a tinderbox, right? I mean, some people said a ticking time bomb. And this is systemic, and so we're not addressing these issues as matters of justice that recognize that our economic system is severely problematic, to put it mildly. Instead, we keep looking at this as if it's some kind of individual moral failure. If somebody's in poverty or they're on the streets. And what we've got to start to realize is that we're all in this together. And we can't flourish as a society unless the person who's the least of these is flourishing. And that's a basic test of biblical justice,
Right.
that God is always concerned, especially about how are the poor doing. And it's not because the poor are more moral or virtuous in God's eyes. Is that God's not an idiot. God knows that the way people who are poor are being treated is indicative of how a society is set up to either be seeking the well-being of all or just seeking the well-being of a few. And right now, our society is very much set up to seek the well-being of just a few.
Well, and that's why it's more and more important for us just to start paying attention. And that's really why I'm doing this series right now. What I've been doing is contacting all kinds of people that I've met at various points in my career and just trying to listen to thinking that this is the first step in ethics, not to argue for solutions that we happen to favor, but just to listen to what's going on, so that once we do try to say, let's try to act in this way or that way, we're doing it on a basis of understanding the real world instead of our imaginary world.
Yeah, and one of the great moral teachers that I look up to is this guy named Jesus. And if you read Mark's gospel in particular, the way Jesus teaches, the way Jesus approaches situations time and time again is by asking questions. And that's what we all need to do. We all need to be asking questions like, why is this going on? What is going on here? How might we learn from the people who are most directly affected what's needed? I mean, Manna House is a listening post in a lot of ways for me to go and listen to people on the streets. They know what it takes to get off the streets. They just don't have the resources to do it. They know they need public transportation. They know they need housing. They know they need healthcare. They know they need jobs. But we just don't listen very well in our culture. And we've set up some people at the top, self-appointed experts, who are rarely in direct relationship with the people they're purportedly concerned about.
Pete, as always, it's fascinating to talk to you, and we could go on a lot longer, but we won't. We'll try to keep this in time, but I would like to come back and visit with you again in a couple months, see what's going on. I mean, if we do have this ticking time bomb going on, homelessness, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And maybe get a better idea of what we need to do to address it. And so thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.